there! Welcome to Skeleton Productions. I'm Conor Graves Cocon. Let's get into the video. Today's video we're continuing with our alternative history series, and in today's video we're going to be asking the question of what if Israel had lost the 6-Day War? Now originally this video was going to be about what if Israel had lost the Yom Kippur War. However, I kind of realised upon doing a bit of research for this that actually Yom Kippur is kind of like a bad sequel to the 6-Day War, right? So there's no point in kind of like going over that because the effects of that are pretty much limited just to the oil shocks, yeah, which we'll talk about. But the thing is, without the 6-Day War, there is no Yom Kippur War, right? So there's no point in focusing just on the Yom Kippur War. That's why we're focusing with the 6-Day War. So with all that being said, obviously don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified, and also check out all the other videos that we have on various different topics. Yeah, you won't be disappointed, I promise you, right? So before we dive into the history of this, I just want to kind of lay out the fact that we have covered a lot of the context for this in our previous video, which is the history of anti-Semitism, and also our video on why people support Israel/Palestine. So people support Israel for various different reasons, people support Palestine for various different reasons, right? Now I just want to say up front that I have a bias towards Israel because it is liberal, it is democratic, and it is Western. And other people support Palestine for other different reasons, etc., etc. So some of my biases may come out in that video, but I just want to say up front so that you know what you're going to be looking for. Now, I'm not like an ultra-Zionist. I'm not someone who's going to have any kind of extreme position on this. It's just a thing of the two sides, I tend to support the Israeli side a bit more. However, where the Israelis were not acting in a liberal or Western or democratic way, I will point those things out, right? And wherever the Palestinians or like the Arabs in general are doing good, I will also point that out as well. I'll try and put it in as much as is possible, a kind of balanced view of the two things. So without further ado, and without all that kind of like caveat being out of the way, now we're going to dive into the history of this conflict. So our story for today starts all the way back in the 19th century where we look at the rise of Zionism. Now, of course, many Jews had wanted to return to the land of Zion and Jerusalem, as had been said in the Hatikvah, which is now the Israeli national anthem. So people, ever since like the exile by the Romans, all the way back in 135 AD, they've always wanted to return back to the land of Israel. However, this was only a small trickle up until the rise of this Zionist movement. And then fast forward now to the end of World War I, and you end up having the Balfour Declaration. And within this Balfour Declaration, it declared that there was going to be a homeland for both the Jews and a homeland for the Arabs, which would respect both religious groups and respect both ethnic groups within that region, right? So that was the kind of foundations of what the British Mandate in Palestine was going to be about. So during this time, this is when you start to have a big influx of Jewish migrants from like Europe and from America and many other places, yeah, to the land that would become Israel. However, there ended up being a huge backlash against this because much in the same way that you saw within many places in Europe during the 50s and 60s and stuff, people were very strongly opposed to mass migration and stuff, right? And this obviously got very, very nasty at times. And it's understandable from our perspective because they're like, hold on, all these people coming in, they're buying land off these absentee Turkish landlords and stuff. They're kind of moving into neighborhoods. There's so many of them that they're kind of swamping their neighborhoods so that they no longer look the same as they did before. So we're going to really oppose this. There end up being riots against them, there end up being pogroms against them, and eventually the British were like, okay, right, we're not going to have any more migration coming in, right? So they paused migration, and this was just before the Holocaust. So during the Holocaust, the Jews weren't able to just mass migrate to Palestine. However, after the Holocaust, this is when you had lots of Jews being like, no, this is evidence that we need a homeland, right? And so more and more of them came, despite what the British authorities wanted to do, and end up being terrorist actions by the Irgun and the Stern Gang against the British authorities, most notably with the terror attack on the King David Hotel in 1946, I believe. So eventually in 1948, the British withdraw, ends up being a UN declaration, and the land is split between the Jews and the Arabs. So this is the formation of the creation of the State of Israel. However, as soon as this was done, all of the neighbouring Arab states decided that they were going to descend on Israel to snuff it out in its cradle and to make sure that Israel was wiped off of the map and that the Jews would be driven back into the sea. However, in spite of all this, despite not having support from the British, Americans or from the French, the Israelis fought off all the Arab armies, and this was the first war for Israel's very survival, the first war of three. And Israel ended up winning, and this is where you end up eventually having the 1949 borders. Although that's a bit of a misnomer, because in 1949 this was merely an armistice line. There were no actual borders because no Arab state recognized the existence of Israel. So you can't have borders with a place that doesn't exist in your eyes, right? So this is just where the Israeli forces were able to hold the line, and this is where the kind of like borders of Israel in a way kind of have been declared as being. Now, I should also include the fact that during this time, this is where you had the Nakba. So in Arabic, this is like the disaster or the catastrophe. And what this basically was 700,000 Arabs either forcibly being expelled or feeling that they wanted to flee and stuff, from the Israelis. And this led to a huge refugee crisis. And many of their descendants still want to go back and settle, although they don't necessarily have the right to settle there. However, many Arabs still live in Israel even to this day, in particular in the northern region where they actually make up a majority still. However, from 1948 to 1966, the Israeli authorities put the Israeli Arabs under military rule. So they're second-class citizens within that state, and they were seen as a fifth column. They were seen as a potential threat, and that's why they were kept under military rule. So this kind of gives like the backdrop of how the state of Israel was created. And I should also say as well that while 700,000 Arabs were expelled from this land, we should also say that there was 260,000 Jews. These were the Mizrahim Jews, and many of them lived in North Africa and in the Middle East. And during the first 3 years of Israel's existence, many of them were either forcibly expelled or they decided to flee because they were suffering from persecution. And between 1948 and 1972, that number increased to 850,000, right? So you had 850,000 Jews fleeing from there. So you had the Nakba, 700,000. This is the Aliyah from the Arabic lands, and this represents 850,000. So within all of that mess, this is the kind of situation that they found themselves in around this time. Also in 1956, Israel, along with Britain and France, attacked Egypt. And this was to do with the Suez crisis. So Nasser, the president of Egypt, nationalized the Suez Canal. And this was an attempt by the British, the French and the Israelis to take that territory back. So as a result of that, the UN sent their emergency forces. So this is the UNEF, and they were put on the Egyptian side of the Egyptian-Israeli border to try and keep peace. And we should also say as well that throughout this whole time, that Egypt had control over the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank was controlled by Jordan. And the Jordanians did not allow any Jews within the West Bank or within the city of Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, no Jews, even though before there had been a majority. Now Jews were not able to enter, and they weren't able to pray at the Western Wall. So from 1948 to 1967, no Jews were allowed in Jerusalem. And yet still, in 1964, you had the setting up of the Palestine Liberation Organization. So this is the PLO, and their stated aim was not about trying to overthrow the occupation of the Egyptians and the Jordanians, right? This was not trying to set up an independent Palestinian state. This was about the destruction of the state of Israel, right? This is what it was founded upon. So 3 years before the occupation of the Gaza and the West Bank, this is when the organization was set up. So there was no real peace, there was no move towards peace during this time. And in 1966, Egypt and Syria signed a mutual defense pact. So just a bit of trivia with regard to this, from 1958 to 1961, Egypt and Syria were one state, right? So they'd actually merged together as the United Arab Republic. So this fell apart, but still they were on very good terms with each other, right? So just a little bit of context with regard to that. And it's within this context that we have May of 1967. So May of 1967, the Soviets, who remember like they're in a Cold War with the Americans, right? So the Soviets during this time, they tended to back the Arabs more because they saw Israel as being an ally of the US, even though America at this point wasn't really that involved. You don't tend to find that kind of like explicit kind of like really strong support between Israel and America. This doesn't really come until the end of the Yom Kippur War. This is when America starts to view Israel as like a strong ally. Before this period, they weren't really that involved, right? So it's kind of not really based on anything, but still the Soviets decided that they wanted to start a war between the Arabs and Israel, right? So it's for that reason that they gave a false report to the Egyptians that the Israelis were going to attack Syria. And so as a result of this, President Nasser decided that what he was going to do is he's going to close the Strait of Tiran. So this is in the southern part of Israel. This stops any kind of like outgoing trade through this strait. And then he decided that he was going to mass troops along the Egyptian-Israeli border. He also signed a defensive pact with Jordan. So now Israel was surrounded. You had Egypt, Jordan, and Syria all making pacts here towards each other. And on top of that, he also called for the withdrawal of all UN emergency forces from the border region. Now, Israel, we should say, never allowed these emergency forces to be there in the first place, but they saw all these things as a clear sign as to what the intent of the Arabs was. And so they decided on the 5th of June 1967 to launch Operation Focus. This was going to be the preemptive attack of all of the Arab armies which were surrounding them. So although they were outnumbered, so the Israelis just had 100,000 troops versus 240,000 Arabs, they end up defeating all of them. So yeah, we're calling it the 6-day war, but realistically, this was pretty much like a 3 to 4 day war, right? Because when the attacks were launched on the 5th of June, they wiped out all of the air forces of the different places. And then when they had aerial supremacy, they then went about and completely decimated the armies of the Arabs, right? So they destroyed Egyptian forces, Syrian forces, Jordanian forces, Lebanese forces, Iraqi forces, and even Saudi forces as well, because there were some foreign contingencies within these places, right? So all of these armies completely wiped out. You had a casualty ratio of 20 to 1, so you had 20,000 Arabs destroyed versus just 1,000 Israelis. And on top of that, you had the seizure of the entirety of the Sinai Peninsula. You had the seizing of Gaza Strip, of West Bank, the Golan Heights, and also, this is something as well, the Israelis were going to go into the east side of the Jordan River. So originally, when the British founded the mandate, they were going to have it as the mandate of Transjordan. So this all was going to be offered up to the Jews as a homeland, but they only just settled with the west side of this, and it's because the Americans basically said, no, you shouldn't cross the Jordan River. So the Israelis thought, okay, we'll listen to you guys, we won't go into the Jordan River, even though we clearly could, right? So you see all this territory here that you see on this map, increasing the size of Israeli territory by almost 5 or 6-fold. And the only reason why the Israelis stopped is because the Israelis decided they wanted to stop. So on the 8th of June, you had the Jordanians and the Egyptians signing a ceasefire. On the 9th of June, you had the Syrians signing a ceasefire. And 2 days later, the Israelis kind of got a bit tired and was like, okay, fine, we'll sign the thing. That's the only reason why it was a 6-day war and not a 3 or 4 day war, right? So it's absolutely devastating. But we have to ask the question of what would have happened if they hadn't done this preemptive attack. What would have happened if they'd allowed the Arabs to mass their forces and eventually to invade Israel and to destroy Israel, which was the stated aim of President Nasser and the other Arab leaders? What would have happened? And that's what we're going to look into here. So first of all, we're going to split up into 4 different sections, right? So we're going to have the effect on Israel, we're going to have the effect on Palestine, we're going to have the effect on the wider world, and we're going to have the effect of basically looking at none of these things would have happened, right? So all these things which have happened since 1967, which we know for a fact happened, all these things wouldn't have ever happened, right? So starting off with Israel, obviously the population of Israel at this time was between 2 to 3 million, right? So if you're having Israel being wiped off the face of the earth and the Jews being driven into the sea, this would have meant between 2 and 3 million Israeli citizens becoming refugees, right? So these Jews would have had to gone to all the different 4 corners of the earth. So once again, the Jews would have been scattered to 4 corners of the earth, and this would have led to a huge a migration crisis as well. And many of these people have been very, very bitter at the West because they were like, you said never again, and yet you've let it happen yet again. The Holocaust had happened, just 20 years before this, and the West stood back and really did nothing to stop the Nazis. And yet we can see the same thing happen again. So the Jews here would have been very, very bitter in all the different lands that they were gone to, and the surviving Jews would have been persecuted or just rounded up and just like anything could have happened to them, right? So that kind of covers what would have happened to Israel. So now, would Palestine have been this happy, free, prosperous kind of like and peaceful place? Probably not. First of all, I think that Palestine probably wouldn't have existed because up until this point, there had been no independent state of Palestine, right? And the Palestinians didn't seem to really mind it. You know, the PLO wasn't founded, to kind of oppose Egyptian occupation of Gaza, nor was it set up for the Jordanian occupation of the West Bank. They were quite happy to be under control of Arabs, right? So long as they weren't under the control of the Jews. So that was really what it was, right? So if this war had happened, right, in a different way, if Israel had been completely destroyed, it's not as if there would be peace. It's not as if there would be prosperity. What would happen is then, if anything, it would be a struggle between the different countries here, right? Because during this time, within the Arab world, you had a huge clash between Baathists and the kind of more conservative monarchies, right? So Egypt and Syria, these were secular, pan-Arab socialist nationalists, whereas places like Jordan, they were run by conservative, traditionalist, religious monarchies, right? So if you'd had this war here, it would have basically just led to a scramble for Israel, right? It wouldn't have led to actual peace because the Jordanians would have wanted some territory and the Egyptians would have wanted some territory, and then there would have been a big fight about which side gets to control Jerusalem, and then, so it would have just led to actual big conflict between this. The Palestinians wouldn't have become freer, they wouldn't have become more prosperous, they wouldn't be living under more peace, right? And I suppose the only thing you could say with this is, as a result of the 1967 war, what ended up happening is that almost 300,000 Palestinians end up becoming refugees. So you already had the Nakba before of 700,000. This is a further 300,000 Palestinians who became refugees. So that wouldn't have happened. So yes, many of these people would have like returned back home to like where they had lived in what is now Israel. But that's kind of it, right? Like, it's not to say that things would have been much better for them. I suppose all the things that kind of happened subsequently with regards to the occupation, etc., that wouldn't have happened. But it would have been just the same thing, just the shoe on the other foot. Because whereas Israel has allowed the Arabs to live there, right, while it has done much to kind of protect them and etc. I'm not saying that they're perfect at all. There are many war crimes and etc. and illegal settlements, etc. But still, Israel, if it wanted to, could have wiped the Arabs out of that whole region, but they haven't. Whereas the Arabs, if the shoe was on their foot, they had the stated aim of wiping the Jews and driving them into the sea. So that's something to really bear in mind. That just because one side is stronger doesn't mean that if you gave that same strength to the other side, that the same side would act equally, right? They wouldn't act as equally morally. That's something to really bear in mind. But obviously, if you disagree with me, we can have a bun fight in the comment section. But yeah, let's save that for now, and let's kind of continue to talk about what the effect on the wider world would have been. So, of course, obviously, like we said before, with regard to the Yom Kippur War, this led to there being oil shocks throughout the 1970s, and this was a result of OPEC nations, basically as a cartel, they raised the oil prices, right? And this was because of perceived Western support of the state of Israel in 1973. However, like I said, the 6-Day War is kind of a prequel, to the Yom Kippur War. Yom Kippur War is just a bad sequel of it, right? So there's not really much point in kind of like focusing so much on it, because you realize that, okay, if Israel had lost the 6-Day War, there would never been a Yom Kippur War. So therefore, you wouldn't have had the oil shocks of the 1970s, which means that, the oil shocks in the 1970s had a huge impact in America, in Britain, and many other places, right? And it led, in particular, within the Anglo-Saxon world, to a shift away from Keynesianism and more towards neoliberalism, right? So the Reagan and Thatcher revolutions would never have happened, or might not never have happened to the same extent that they end up happening in our time. Arguably, we still have a lot of Keynesianism today, but it would have been much more so had this not ever happened, right? And also something to bear in mind is all of these Jewish refugees fleeing from Israel, they would have settled in the places where the diaspora is strongest today. And this is America, this is France, this is Britain, Canada, Australia, those kind of places, right? So they would have had even more people fleeing to there. And especially if you think of like American politics at this time. So the Jews, overwhelmingly in America, vote for the Democratic Party. However, with a Democrat president at the time, who was LBJ, right, if Israel had been destroyed under his watch, bear in mind everything that was happening in the Vietnam War, which is why the Americans didn't really have their eye on the ball for this, right? If Israel had been able to have been destroyed under his watch, many Jews living in America might likely have voted against the Democratic Party and might very well have gone to Richard Nixon, who won that election anyway. Never mind also, on top of that, all of these angry Jewish refugees coming from Israel, right? The survivors of this disaster, right? These people here would have had a lot of vengeance, right? As soon as they became US citizens, they would never have forgiven the Democratic Party for allowing Israel to be destroyed. And I suppose with regard to all that, that covers the effect on the wider world. But these are some of the things which never would have happened. So first of all, we have to say that Israel has not always been a liberal democratic state, right? For the first 18 years of its existence, it could have been described in some limited way as an apartheid state because of this military rule that we had, right? Like I've already said. However, like we said in 1966, this actually ended. So Israeli Arabs were given the same voting rights, the same legal rights, the same civil rights as their Jewish counterparts within the state of Israel. So equal citizenship was offered to them, right? So Israel today is the only pluralistic, democratic, liberal society in the Middle East which has a majority that still respects and protects the minority, right? It's not perfect. There's still discrimination there on a local level, but still it offers that. Whereas none of the other states in the Middle East offer that at all. And if Israel had been destroyed, there is no way that any Arab power which would have taken over would have given the Jews equal citizenship. They would have been second-class citizens at best, and that's a fact throughout all of history. They've always been dhimmis, right? So that's something to really bear in mind. And also as well, as a result of the 6-Day War, you then had the Yom Kippur War. As a result of the Yom Kippur War, you end up having the Camp David Accords, right, in 1979 between Egypt and Israel. So check out the video that came out recently by a casual historian. It's a really, really great video with regard to that. It covers it in a lot of depth. I learned lots of things, but that never would have happened. This is when Egypt recognized Israel, and over the period of the next 5 years, Israel withdrew from all of the Egyptian land, all of the Sinai. So Israel has always had a policy of trading land for peace. You recognize us, we'll withdraw our troops. So the same has been offered time and time again. So they offered it to Egypt, this was given. They offered it to Syria, Syria didn't take it up, that's why they still have control of the Golan Heights. Jordan ended up recognizing Israel, they now have a peace with each other, right? Israel has tried time and time again to do this with the Palestinians. They withdrew from Gaza Strip in 2005. They pulled out all the settlers, and bear in mind also in the Sinai, they pulled out settlers who had lots of investment, etc., etc. And how were they repaid? Well, people in Gaza elected Hamas, and then Hamas started firing rockets into Israel, and it's been a hell ever since, right? So Israel looks at this and they see that for the West Bank, and they go, we can't allow West Bank to become like Gaza. So that's why the occupation is still there, but none of this would need to have been happening in the first place, right? If the Arabs had just recognized them before 1967, if they hadn't threatened them in 1967, which caused them to actually have to attack in this preemptive way, right? If the 6-Day War had never happened, then, they could have been peace, right? So Israel had to do this, yeah? So when we say this would never have happened, in terms of Israel had no choice but to do this preemptive attack, and it couldn't afford to lose, because if it lost the 6-Day War, there would be no Israel. Time and time again, the Arabs have lost a war to Israel, and there still is a Palestine, there still is a Egypt, there still is etc., etc., right? The same could not be said if Israel lost any of the wars that it's fought with the Arabs. And with that being said, I just want to lay out the fact that starting from this week, and every 2 weeks from now on, we're going to have a 5-part history of Israel, right? So the first video is going to be starting in 1799 and it's going to end in 1917. Then the second video is going to be to do with the British mandates. This is 1917 to 1948. The next video after that is going to be 1948 to 1967. The video after that is going to be 1967 to the year 2000, and then the final and fifth video is going to be the year 2000 to the present day. It's going to cover all the history of that region and all the kind of things that happened during all this time in a very in-depth way, because what I've realized through doing different studies with regard to history is the history that everyone knows about isn't particularly interesting, and the history that people don't really know much about or kind of just gets glossed over in a very kind of quick overview of like, oh well, this happened and that happened, etc, etc, that's very surface level. So what we're going to do is do like a deep dive of all that and look into what the situation was like on the ground during these eras, right? And yeah, I hope that you really enjoyed that, and I hope that you come along for the journey. So to make sure that you don't miss that, don't forget, obviously, hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, hit the bell button so you stay notified when all these videos come out. And also as well, in the meantime, check out all of our other videos about various different topics. And if you have any topic ideas as well that you'd like me to kind of cover in any great depth, please do, right? I kind of got the idea for this for, oh my god, I've forgotten the dude's name, sorry. It's on screen at the moment. So big shout out to them, and I'm going to be using some of the images which they found when we do our video on the British Mandate, right? So in the meantime, have a great day and bye.